My family and I had just arrived in Hong Kong to live for 2 years when we turned on the television one night and happened to see live transmission from the storming of the Legislative Council building, the Let's Go, the night of July 1st. There had been mass demonstrations all day with thousands of people. The live footage was intense and powerful and showed thousands of black-dressed masked protesters with umbrellas and yellow helmets storming the Central House of Power in Hong Kong, spraying anti-China and anti-government graffiti all over the place, tearing down portraits and flags. It almost felt like a coup taking place. It seemed like an explosive and unpredictable situation. I remember thinking that these images of the protesters at the Let's Go would become iconic to the movement, but somehow they didn't. Of course, most Hong Kongers remember that night, but as a visual reference, it is lost in the huge wave of visual material coming in the wake of the protests. But what kind of visual material actually draw the lines of the movement? This talk is concerned with the visual resistance of the movement, along with what this visuality can tell us about this particular moment in Hong Kong's history. In this talk, I'll show how the visual resistance has developed from handwritten post-it notes to become a decentralized, organic functioning PR machine that is promptly and ingeniously responding to events on the street, in the press, and on the political arena, in a fast-paced battle for the truth. The visuality ranges from slogans calling for revolution, drawings of protesters as manga cartoon characters and superheroes, memes ridiculing the government, prints with graphic depictions of police violence, educational pamphlets, and on to small stickers reminding people to keep hope and their mental well-being, and so much more. The physical side of this visuality is signified by the printed material wallpapered on the numerous protest walls sprinkled across the territory of Hong Kong. My argument is that these walls represent physical extensions of the digital PR machine body, and function as vital sites of resistance, allowing for another temporality and another kind of participation than the short-term explosions of the weekly demonstrations, or the massiveness of the visual production unfolding online and on social media platforms. The material hung on protest walls will usually stay there longer, while posters hung on walls and lampposts in relation to demonstrations will be removed more quickly. Through a clear visual strategy, the movement occupies and territorializes public spaces, not with their bodies, but with printed material. I argue that this printed material, the posters, the sticky notes, could be understood as prolongations of the body. And by this I mean that it is almost as if you're standing next to other protesting bodies when you read the posters and the post-it notes. In other words, these spaces of the city become pockets of prefigurative politics, enacting another Hong Kong than the one we have today. In this talk, I'll show some of the constantly shifting visual markers that have dominated the visual resistance and present some of the possible routes into understanding this visual surge and the machinery behind it that has been sweeping through Hong Kong for the past many months. But first, I'll introduce some of the background of the movement. The situation that originally sparked the protests was a proposed amendment to the law on extradition that would make it possible for China and other countries to extradite suspects from Hong Kong. The fear from the population in Hong Kong was that China would be able to use this agreement to legally extradite people they deemed politically problematic. Early June 2019 saw the first huge mass rallies with several million participants. On September 4, after 3 months of heavy and intense protesting, the amendment was finally withdrawn. However, by then, to many protesters, the movement had already become about something different and more comprehensive than just the bill. The call for Hong Kongers to add oil had already changed to Hong Kongers revolt, and the slogan was no longer "No extradition to China," but "Liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our time." The movement had become a full-fledged resistance movement, in direct conflict with the police and the administration of Hong Kong, and with 5 clear demands. The demands are: 1. Complete withdrawal of the extradition bill, which has already happened. 2. Release of arrested protesters without charges. 3. Withdrawal of the characterization of all protests as riot. 4. Independent investigation into police brutality, and this is actually the one that is mostly debated and which might take place. 5. Implementation of full universal suffrage. In this talk, I refer to what is happening in Hong Kong as a movement. However, while they have clearly and successfully advocated the 5 demands and seem on the surface to work towards a common goal, they have, on the other hand, refrained from proposing a basic code or other clear-cut descriptions of what they want after the 5 demands. Besides the fact that the majority of the protesters are students, it is not entirely clear who they are, how fragmented the movement is, or how many different groups or leadership groups it consists of. The movement is often referred to as leaderless, which I think is both true and not true. There are most likely groups that take more dominant roles than others in defining the direction. We just don't know who these groups or singular people are. The movement is primarily defined by what it is against. That is the current Hong Kong administration, Chinese influence on Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong police. However, being so loosely defined in terms of what the movement wants, leave ample space for individual interpretation. As it is now, the movement includes positions ranging from Democrats, anarchists, anti-capitalists, as well as nationalists and to some degree even chauvinistic sentiments. By chauvinistic, I refer to a deep-felt hatred against uncivilized mainlanders, and the nationalistic claims to a specific Hong Kong identity, excluding mainlanders and many other with this category, mainlanders being people from the Chinese mainland. To most European and North American media outlets, the movement seems to be about a wish for representative democracy, often neglecting the anarchist and anti-capitalist currents also contained in the movement. Nevertheless, this lack of definition makes it possible for the movement to be what you want it to be and to change as needed. In this sense, the movement is itself being water, as the slogan goes, in resisting definition to what that would exclude parts of the protesters from being part of the movement. The anti-extradition movement is also sometimes called the water revolution, in reference to Bruce Lee's famous idea of being like water. Quote, "Instead of trying to impose on his mind, he adjusts himself to his opponent like water pressing on an earthen wall. It flows through the slightest crack. There is nothing to try to do but try to be purposeless and formless like water." Unquote. This thinking of being like water has really become a mantra of the movement, often understood as a new way of protesting, as opposed to the way of the umbrella movement in 2014, that had a main stage from where the supposed leaders of the movement would talk. Since all the leaders of the umbrella movement were imprisoned afterwards, this new movement will not expose itself in the same manner, by putting itself and its leaders out there. Instead, it would be water. My method to research this movement has been somewhat coincidental. I happened to arrive in Hong Kong just about when it all started, and I've been taking documentary photographs often, but in no way systematically to begin with. I research socially engaged art projects in Hong Kong, and these projects take place in small mountain villages, in suburban districts, and centrally on Hong Kong Island. And on my way to these places, I would often pass protest walls, as they're usually located close to metro stations and other transportation hubs. After some months in Hong Kong, I started following the visuality of the movement more thoroughly. I've been trying to document as much as I could of material hung in public spaces, as well as digital material. However, the amount of visual material produced is massive, and I do not purport to know every single piece that is produced or printed. The visual battle unfolds online, on social media platforms, and on the streets of Hong Kong, particularly on and around the more than 150 so-called Lenin Walls that are scattered across the city. The Lenin Walls are called so in reference to the Prague Lenin Wall, originally set up in remembrance of John Lennon's assassination, but beginning in 1988, used as a place to express dissatisfaction with the Soviet regime. The umbrella movement in 2014 is known for maintaining one very large Lenin Wall near Admiralty on Hong Kong Island, with tens of thousands of post-it notes expressing wishes for democracy and universal suffrage. For this new round of protests, beginning June 2019, the Lenin Walls have spread like wildfires, or water one might say, to the rest of the city. And I'm just gonna show you a video. Er der lyd egentlig? Okay. Ellers så er der lyd fra min computer. Jeg tror det er fint nok. Ja. This is just to show you like what the Lenin Walls are, basically. Det er fint. This was just to give you a sense of what the Lenin Walls are. Yeah. So on this crowdsourced map, we see the location of Lenin Walls across Hong Kong. So they are often located near transport interchanges, on footbridges, and in underpasses where many people pass by every day. They're seen in smaller and larger versions, often in public places, but also on shops, at the universities or other institutions. Only a handful of post-it notes, a small table and some pens seems to be enough to make you understand that you're looking at a Lenin Wall. Seeing how the current Lenin Walls have spread across the city, I think it is important to understand how different the current movement is compared to the umbrella movement of 2014. First of all, the umbrella movement was largely a long-term occupation that took place at 3 sites, the central one in Admiralty, as well as in Mongkok and Causeway Bay. The current movement, on the other hand, is multi-sided, meaning that every weekend there are demonstrations all over Hong Kong and in new places each weekend, implicating many more neighborhoods and communities than the umbrella movement. The Lenin Walls and the visual side of the movement have gone through a significant evolution. In the beginning, the visual expression of the walls were primarily made up of handwritten post-it messages and drawings by people passing by, as we saw in the video. While post-it notes are still written and hung on walls, the dominant visual expression of the fluorescent colors of the post-it notes has largely been replaced by a more organized approach, in which professional artists, graphic designers, and other individuals and groups produce graphic content that are made freely available online through a Google Drive, via messaging services such as Signal or Telegram, or through AirDrop, for all to print and for anyone to hang and use as they deem fit. Now the walls look more like wallpapered poster stands, repeating the same message over and over again. To understand the distribution of printed material during the Hong Kong protest movement, I'll explain how what I call the organic function and PR machine operates, at least for the time being. I call it a machine in reference to the pace and almost mechanical determinacy with which it works, from the production of material to the distribution digitally, and on to the distribution in physical space, typically on the Lenin Walls. In a machine, each part is equally important with its own definite function. Furthermore, each part is also replaceable, meaning that anybody can take over when somebody has to leave. Also, in this particular machine, anybody can step in and be a part of it at any time, just by printing a poster and hanging it on a wall. On the level of content producers, we have a lot of different actors and groups contributing content. There are the people who are involved in what is called the PR group, the Wenxuan, which essentially comprises an anonymous group of between 200 to 600 people, consisting of designers and other people who are able to produce graphic content and do it quickly. They share their work as PDF files on public Telegram channels for everybody to print and distribute, physically or digitally. These Telegram channels have between a couple of thousand followers and up to 145,000 followers. Followers can also submit material to the PR group. Oh, the numbers are not updated on this one. But followers can also submit material to the PR group, who will then distribute it digitally. The PR group channel usually react within a few hours to events and incidents taking place on the streets and the political arena, presenting their side of the story or disclosing information they think the government or the police are trying to conceal. There is an abundance of material produced and spread online, and some of this material make it onto the street, and some of the material made for the street makes it back onto the wired landscape of the social media. It is a well-organized machine at the same time as individuals can quickly put an imprint on the movement by producing material or by printing and posting material in a public space. Another group of content producers are the artists and groups that work independently of the PR group. Many artists contribute artworks and post them on Instagram and make them available for download. Many such artists have fully public identities. Usually other people print and hang their work on the Lenin Walls. There are also groups and individuals that work anonymously and produce material for the street themselves, such as the anonymous group Midnight Glue. Midnight Glue uses visual guerrilla warfare tactics by inserting their life-size renditions of police violence in public spaces. The quickly disappearing instances of power abuse seen on the streets of Hong Kong are somehow perpetuated through these artworks as they hang there as violent reminders of what we're not supposed to see. Returning to the PR machine, an often used method of the PR group is what we could call a recuperation of symbols. That is, they take an existing symbol and give it a new meaning, in service of their purpose. Here we see Pepe the Frog, who was used by right-wing supporters of President Trump, but who is now an avid supporter of the Hong Kong protests. Another one is the Chinese character Mei from the company Blizzard's game Overwatch. Blizzard punished some of their gamers for openly supporting the protesters in Hong Kong, so the protesters decided to turn one of the Blizzard characters into a supporter. Also, we have the well-known children's game of Monopoly, now referring to the police, known as the Popo, and their government-granted monopoly on violence. And here Carrie Lam seems to actually be the Joker from the Batman movies. Beside Carrie Lam and the police, another common enemy of the protesters is authoritarian China. They ridicule Xi Jinping, or Xini the Pooh as he's known, and make efforts to enlighten everybody of the historical suppression of the Communist Party of China. They present Mao in the outfit of a protester here, and use popular and well-known Mao quotes to justify action against the government, such as, quote, "Revolution is no crime, to rebel is justified," unquote. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, as well as the Chinese government's stubborn concealment of the events, have become a recurring symbol of the movement. They could have tied their battle to the current situation for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or the continued struggle of the Tibetans, but they have only done so to a very limited degree. The symbol of the Tiananmen protests are deemed the most effective proxy for referring to Communist Party suppression and for arousing sympathy with the cause. The Tiananmen massacre is not only well known in Europe and North America, it is also an intrinsic part of the self-understanding of many young Hong Kongers. Growing up in a Hong Kong that was returning to China less than 10 years after the incident. In his seminal book on Hong Kong culture from 1997, Akbar Abbas describes the 1989 Tiananmen massacre as one of two traumas that confirmed Hong Kong people's fear of losing the Hong Kong that they knew, the other being the 1997 handover itself. The Tiananmen trauma is reenacted again and again in the visual material of the movement. Furthermore, the situation in November 2019 at Polytechnical University, where protesters hit during a 12-day police siege, was again and again referred to as a new Tiananmen massacre. Many of these representations of China are often accompanied by educational infographics that wishes to enlighten the people of Hong Kong of the suppression of the Chinese state, then as well as now. This educational and informative approach can be tied directly to the notion of the Communist Party and the government as concealing information. The category of infographics seeks to provide the public with various types of information. So here are some examples of infographics. The first one over there tells you where to buy your fruit, and is a somewhat ironic take on the fact that fruits from outdoor markets have often been contaminated by tear gas. Readers are therefore instructed not to buy fruit from the local street vendor, as they get their fruits from fruit markets. Instead, you should buy fruits in the supermarket that are flown in from other places, such as Australia or Japan. The second one tells you what not to wear on Election Day, November 24th, as opposed to what you should usually wear during demonstrations. The third one tells you which press services are reliable, and the last one is a guide to the use of Twitter in spreading the message of what is going on in Hong Kong. And this is just a really small sample of infographics to give you an idea of the scope. However, infographics are used as a method to counter a dominant narrative and attempts of the government to conceal information. Another predominant method to produce content is to look towards events on the street during demonstrations and use that information to produce content and symbols to be used in the battle of the public opinion. On August 11, a female nurse and protester on the back lines got shot in the eye with a beanbag round, supposedly by the police. As usual, in the hours and days after the incident, a surge of graphic content was produced, providing the movement with an ideal hero, and yet another symbol of police violence and power abuse. Here they repeat the same symbol over and over again, and multiply the visual output by presenting different versions of the same. As if shooting with a shotgun, there are cartoonish versions, Pepper the Frog versions, hand-painted versions, fact sheet versions, watercolor versions, dramatic versions, soft versions, and so forth, all catering to different people and different segments of society. Nevertheless, the young woman is primarily presented as a girlish, innocent protester shot directly in the face for no good reason. This representation of the protesters as innocent, loving, and vulnerable recur in many of the depictions of the protesters, like in this picture. This image also represents another method the graphic content producers use, where they directly transform press photos into graphic content, as we see in this example. The watercolor version by Fung Kin Fan seems soft and emotional and carry a broad appeal, whereas the manga version adds a somewhat magical layer and places the couple within a community of protesters. This method of press photo to graphic is, for one, a faster way to work, since most of the composition is already given. However, the method is also important in the way that it lends the authenticity of the press photo to that of the artwork. In this sense, legitimating the movement's claim to truth. Using this method, the movement can quickly produce authentic and true symbols and heroes because they're based on actual events. The same is going on here. Here we see Uncle Wang from the group Protect the Children, a well-known figure on the streets during demonstrations. And here we see the different figures of the protest movement, drawn with a black pen adding a dramatic red. This digital drawing gives a good impression of how the protesters and their opponents are often portrayed. At the forefront of the drawing is the woman with her one-eyed shot that we already know. Behind her are different kinds of protesters, from the frontliners engaged in fighting to the paramedics at the back, from the elderly people such as Grandpa Wang, and to the school children. There are thus protesters of all kinds, and they do not use lethal weapons like the police, but defend themselves against violent powers with seemingly harmless utensils such as umbrellas, tennis rackets, slingshots, and crutches. Here we see yet another method, the appropriation of classic paintings. There are a lot of these. I just chose a predominant one. This is an appropriation of Delacroix's Romanticist oil painting, Liberty Leading the People, commemorating the July Revolution of 1830 taking place in France. The inscription below the new version says, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Time," one of the most popular and repeated slogans of the movement. This new version is entitled Our Vantage, and is supposedly created by the individuals behind the Instagram account, Hardcore Romanticist. We have no way of knowing who Hardcore Romanticist is, and the account has only posted 2 posts, both with images of Our Vantage. The name Harcourt refers to Harcourt Road, the central location on Hong Kong Island of the umbrella movement. And it is also a pun on the word hardcore. Romanticist seems to refer to the romantic history of uprising and revolution present in the romantic classic of Delacroix's painting and in the history of the umbrella movement itself. The poster has been printed out in large versions and hung on several key locations and Lenin Walls across Hong Kong. Here on this one, it is placed in a central position at the Lenin Wall of Polytechnic University. In this new version, a non-identifiable protester carries the black flag with the bauhinia flower of Hong Kong. The protesters are all dressed the same, and it is therefore not possible to distinguish between them to single out a leader or a leadership. They all look like heroes, fighting the war at the front lines. Towards the front bottom of the image, we see a protester reaching out and helping another protester, symbolizing the compassion of the movement. We have the paramedics to the left, and to the right we see traffic signs for shields and fragments of a barricade made of roadwork barriers, placing the protesters directly in the act of reclaiming the street. The image as a whole shows a somewhat romanticized act of territorialization. They're conquering a territory and placing their flag as a symbol of their victory. Though, unlike the original, in this version, there are no dead bodies under the feet of the conquerors and no lethal weapons in their hands. The figure of the protester with helmet and flag in hand is constantly reproduced in new settings and new designs. Most of the designs repeat the slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of our time," as well as the other most well-known slogan of the 5 demands. One of the two, on the 2 posters in the lower corners, there is a number, like on that one, 831. This refers to the date August 31st, where the police entered a metro train carriage and allegedly beat people at random. The footage is quite violent, so I won't show it here. My point here is not to spell out the obvious police violence going on, but rather how the dates in themselves constitute important anniversaries of the movement. And I somehow didn't translate this, but it states various dates of the movement. The protesters seem to be using the dates to constitute new traditions for their new community. For their imagined community, they thus create a sense of coherence through a shared history and through reasons to gather, things to remember, or more importantly, things not to forget, as they phrase it. Even a national anthem has been composed to accompany this new community. These images are press photographs from the night and morning of November 12 and 13, taken during the violent clashes between protesters and the police at Chinese University of Hong Kong, in what seemed to be a quite serious escalation of the conflict. Looking at the photographs to the left, it almost looks like the protesters are reenacting the scene from the appropriation of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. In some sense, they provoked a performance of the imaginary they have been advocating through the PR group. They are carrying the flag in the middle of the battle, seemingly aware of the powerful and dramatic imagery the flag, the smoke, the fighting protesters, and the light from the flames are creating. The photograph to the right shows a scene from the early morning when the police have retreated and the protesters have entrenched themselves at Chinese University. The morning light and the protesters looking towards the horizon, as if waiting for a new beginning, waiting for the new community to come to life. The new beginning lasted 4 days, the period of time when they occupied Chinese University before they retreated to other positions within the city. It is, of course, difficult for the protesters to control the press in their documentation of the protests. But as the photo is repeated again and again on the PR group Telegram channel, it seems the protesters are also well aware of the importance of visual material in the battle for public opinion and the truth. This circular movement of imaginaries from life to graphic rendition and back to life says something about the importance of visual means in the act of protest on one hand, and of how they in this act of protest perform the imaginary. Returning again to the Lenin Walls, where all this material I have just presented to you hang. It's important to understand how these walls have become very contested spaces, and as a consequence, they're constantly changing. They began with being composed of colorful sticky notes, with handwritten messages and drawings, expressing the thoughts of many different Hong Kongers. However, these sticky notes walls have routinely been torn down by proponents. So this is what we could call a defaced Lenin wall. It happens at increasingly frequent intervals that the materials of the Lenin walls are torn down. Sometimes by the police or people from the neighborhood who disagree with protesters. Sometimes the local authority have the material taken down. In the northern city of Taipei, to make it more difficult to remove the post-it notes, they taped all the messages to the wall. However, as the walls changed from being composed of easily removable post-it notes to being wallpapered with protest posters and printouts, the defacement of the walls came to appear more violent, even scarred. These spaces of resistance are constantly contested by pro-Beijing and pro-government people tearing down the posters, however only to experience that new material has been put up the next day, covering the scars of the previous day's destruction, in a perpetual motion, a constant process of deteriorization and reterialization. Even though new posters and material is constantly put up on the walls, the mood around them has changed. Not only is the material violently taken down, there are also recurring incidents of physical conflicts between people in the spaces surrounding the walls, resulting in several physical fights and knife attacks. There have been recurring incidents of males yelling and aggressively tearing down the material and stabbing people that try to stop them. The Lenin Walls are no longer the safe spaces they used to feel like, but rather they're open wounds testifying to the divide slowly tearing Hong Kong to pieces. What I have not covered in this talk is how the visual resistance culture in Hong Kong compares to that of other ongoing conflicts in other places of the world. I wonder whether they have an equally effective PR machine in Chile. I have seen lots of sharing between these sites of protest and utterances of solidarity, but each site also seems quite particular with its own sets of obstacles and internal conflicts and wishes for the future. Further research into the overlapping themes and imaginaries of the visual resistance in these regions would be a good way to further this research. Another aspect I have not covered here is that of the pro-government and as well as the Chinese side. I have seen a few posters and few graffiti writings on the wall here and there in support of Carrie Lam and China, but more research could definitely go into this part of the visuality. In this talk, however, I have shown some of the things the protesters in Hong Kong do visually, and how the PR group and fellow protesters appropriate, adjust, recuperate, and steal existing symbols, designs, art pieces, press photos, commercials, cartoon characters, and more, and give the material a new message. And then they repeat that message over and over again in various formats and on various platforms. The main methods I've covered in this talk are how they recuperate symbols, the method of lending the authenticity of the press photo, the use of infographics as a counter-narrative to the government, and the appropriation of classic paintings, lending the recognition inherent in the original painting to that of the protesters. The majority of these methods legitimizes the movement's claim to truth, showing how authenticity and truth are central tropes within the movement. Furthermore, the use of the Tiananmen massacre as one of the central symbols of, on the one hand, ties to this claim of truth and to the wish for open information, and on the other hand, serves as a reenactment of the trauma embedded in this generation of Hong Kongers. During the peak of the Lenin Walls, the walls functioned at vital sites of resistance, where people of all kinds gathered and shared their thoughts. As the occurrences of violent physical attacks in relation to the walls grew, fewer people posted sticky notes on the walls. Nevertheless, the walls are still maintained through the PR machine, who continue to produce material with an unforeseen speed. However, with the plurality of expressions inherent in the post-it note system gone, the walls spell out a more narrow story. Perhaps we can no longer call them Lenin Walls, though the memory of them there definitely lingers. I would like to end this talk with a few more words from Akbar Abbas, from his 1997 book on Hong Kong culture. Quote, "Living in interesting times is a dubious advantage. In fact, a curse according to an old Chinese saying. Interesting times are periods of violent transitions and uncertainty. People in Hong Kong, faced with the prospects of 1997, clearly live in interesting times, unquote. While the year 1997 is already long gone, the prospects are still there in the face of Hong Kong. Applying the method of being like water, the protesters are at the same time reenacting the trauma of Tiananmen as they're using all their strength fighting against it. Thank you.